As you said, I mean, almost one of the most exciting things in the sector is the pace of innovation. I speak to suppliers, technology providers that have come up with something new almost every week. And it's just incredible. Again, why we need technology openness and policy, right? Is because we don't know what will get us to 10 gigatons. I'm almost certain we don't
Yeah.
know the technologies yet, right? We're still in the early stages, in the V1s, V2s of the sector.
Welcome to Carbon Conversations, a podcast by Biochar Life, where we explore the cutting edge of environmental solutions. From biochar to smart agriculture to the climate tech revolution, we sit down with experts and business leaders at the forefront of change. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Hey, Sebastian, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for having me, Matt. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm in a co-working space today because we are smoked out of the house. There's so much smoke in northern Thailand. So good that we're here to talk about here to talk about carbon capture and the removal space. So before I get you to do an intro, I thought good for our audience. You and I had a bit of back and forth. We haven't met before, but obviously we had some emails back and forth, and you picked up some areas where I'd used some terminology wrong, and I thought good opportunity with your background to do a bit of glossary of terms, really, because I think in this industry we're always using acronyms. We're using terms like carbon capture and carbon storage, which I'll get you to explain the difference in a minute. So yeah, let's just run through a few because I've not done this before, and I think for our audience, very useful to know a lot of these acronyms and terms we're often using. The one that you picked me up on, I'd used carbon. Sorry, what did I use? Carbon capture instead of carbon removal. Even I can't remember, but yeah, go for it. Let's start there, and then I'll run through some others. Cheers.
Yes, for sure. So carbon capture and storage, or often referred to as CCS, is on the surface just a technology to essentially capture CO2 and then ideally permanently storing it in a product, underground, wherever. But in colloquial language, and what most people mean when they say CCS, is actually an industrial process where industrial carbon that has, imagine a steel factory, an oil and gas facility, anywhere where we create essentially fossil emissions, we take that CO2 before it reaches the atmosphere from the facility itself, and then ideally store it underground. This is what most people mean. It's also called fossil or point source CCS, but people leave out the first words and just say CCS. Now, why is this important? Because this process deals with fossil CO2 that was in the ground. We decided to pump it out of the ground, but now we're putting it back. So from a carbon perspective, it's a neutral, in the best case, a carbon neutral process. Whereas maybe I can immediately make the switch to carbon removal. Carbon removal doesn't take fossil CO2, but it takes atmospheric CO2, CO2 that is already out in the atmosphere because we've emitted it in the past. And we take the CO2 and store it permanently underground or elsewhere. And that's a carbon negative process, because if we hadn't done this, the CO2 would still be in the atmosphere. Now, people might say, that's semantics. But actually, when we're talking about reaching net zero, for example, we need both. But to get that final bit of hard to abate or residual emissions down to zero, we can only use carbon negative removals. And so when people say CCS, but they mean CDR, it's actually very different industries, different processes, some shared technology, for example, for transporting CO2, for storing CO2, but fundamentally different climate objectives.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. Look, and thanks for picking me up on it. I think, again, it was a good segue into this podcast. Let's just run through a few very super quick ones. MRV.
Monitoring or measurement, reporting and verification. The M can stand for both. And MRV is essentially, if I had to put it in one sentence, how do we prove that something has actually happened, right? How do we prove that a removal has actually occurred? You need to monitor it, you need to report it, and you need to verify it. So it's a crucial building block in creating trust in carbon removals or any other, essentially climate policy. But yeah, this is what MRV is.
Cool. CDR, very simple, but again,
Carbon dioxide removal, and it's basically we're capturing atmospheric CO2 and sequestering or storing it, ideally permanently, in different types of sinks. It can be underground, it can be the ocean, it can be in products.
Cool. VCM?
The voluntary carbon market, which is basically where currently carbon credits are being traded, both for emission reduction, for emission avoidance, and for carbon removal. And this is where corporate buyers primarily purchase credits to then usually essentially offset against their own emissions. And in the absence of compliance markets run by governments, this is currently where all the action is at.
Cool. And finally, co-benefits, which sounds like it should be obvious, but even the other day I was on a call and I had to kind of go through what that meant with a potential buyer. So yeah, co-benefits.
In the space of CDR, obviously the main outcome of carbon removal is removing carbon, right? And so co-benefits refers to what else is happening besides the removing of carbon that is good for society, for the environment. So an example is improving soil health, for example, would be a co-benefit. Reducing pollution would be a co-benefit. So these are all the kind of nice add-ons that we can achieve, and they vary a lot depending on what carbon removal approach you take.
Cool. Sebastian, thank you. Not the end of the podcast, the beginning of the podcast, but I thought really good opportunity. Look, we've not met before, and I see the great updates you put online and the work you're doing with Carbonfuture and with yourself, as well as looking at your website. Maybe a second starting point. Great to just tell us about your journey into kind of climate advocacy. What inspired you to get into the sector, and talk to us about that journey so far, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe starting off, I'm an economist by training. I studied in the UK and the US. I've always been interested in how we can scale markets. I was a tech entrepreneur for around 10 years, working in global development. So this was more essentially, how can we make the aid industry a whole different topic, more transparent, more efficient, less corrupt. Fascinating job. But then I became a bit cynical about the whole industry. And in 2020, I had a great opportunity to join Angela Merkel's Chancellery for her last 2 years of her long 16 years heading up the German state. And I switched from becoming an entrepreneur to becoming a lobbyist. And I worked essentially as Angela Merkel's lobbyist for crypto Web3, which was interesting to advocate for that on behalf of a government. I don't think there were many of my kind. But something was brewing inside of me. I'd already seen quite a lot in my work around Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, in terms of climate change impact. But really what drove it home for me was I come from the Dolomites, a beautiful part of the Alps in Italy. And in 2018, we had a storm called Vaia that in the span of a few hours tore down 18 million trees and created 3 billion of damages. And when you come from a place like this, trees and the forests are not just, something you look at. They are part of your identity. And when that happened, it really tore a big cut into people's sanity and health and well-being in where I come from. And that was a big wake-up moment. And I decided to move from digitization Web3 into climate tech because I love technology. And I landed on carbon removals and never looked back. It sounded too good to be true. And I was surprised that not more people speak about it, do it, talk about it. And so this was something that I decided I had to get involved with.
Cool. I can completely relate to your journey. So I was in blockchain and Web3 before this. So, but also, yeah, as I said at the beginning, I'm in the north of Thailand, where we're right in the middle of our burning season, and it doesn't get too much kind of global press, but yeah, Chiang Mai is #1 most polluted city in the world right now, and is every year at this time.
God.
So it's great to be able to, you can kind of moan about these things, or you can try and find ways to kind of work on them and fix them, right? So yeah, completely kind of relate to your journey. As someone who's been in advisory role in around policy, what do you think are the kind of critical paths for advancing carbon removal? We're still it still feels young, but the challenge is very near. What are some of the kind of critical pathways for advancing the removal sector in terms of policy?
So I like to think about policy for carbon removal in terms of carrots and sticks. Carrots are incentives and sticks are compliance. And different geographies around the world will require different approaches. In the US, for example, compliance is a big no-go politically, and you have to focus on incentives. In Europe, we're pretty used to forcing essentially companies to do certain things. And so in the US, we will essentially look at something like tax credits, at CapEx support. In Europe, we will be looking at integration into compliance markets like the European trading system, which is a 762 billion a year already market for carbon, the biggest in the world. And we will have to integrate carbon removals into it in the 2030s. So these are kind of the biggest potential avenues. And again, if we just remember the scale of the challenge, we have to scale the carbon removal industry to around 10 gigatons per year, which is an absurdly high number by 2050. And for comparison, for listeners who might not be able to relate to that number, the oil and gas industry globally moved 5 gigatons of material last year.
Wow.
So we're talking about an absurdly large industry that I think can only be created through compliance and through having a polluters pay principle where companies that pollute will have to pay for removal. But again, this is kind of my assumption and what I primarily work on, but it will take a while to realize.
How important, this seems like an obvious question, but international cooperation in addressing the issue, and I suppose the role of policy in that. Many of these things just process slows things down, but it's also needed. How important is it? I mean, it seems like a silly question. It must be very important, but the truth is, it seems like there's a lot of different things going on in different places. So it's kind of why I ask as well.
I mean, it's a fair question, and climate change is a global problem. You would assume that we should cooperate and create global solutions for climate change. And in the voluntary carbon market that we talked about at the very beginning, that is kind of happening, right? You've got companies from the global north purchasing carbon credits, including carbon removal, from the global south very often. So we've got a good mechanism set up there, but again, the VCM will only get us so far. On the policy side and on the government side, in reality, in practice, there's not as much happening as there should be. We are creating borders. Politicians don't like to spend tax dollars beyond their borders if it's not aid, which is a small budget. And so I'm quite skeptical that we'll be able to have genuine collaboration on carbon removal and on climate change more broadly beyond kind of agreements. And a lot of hope rests on the UNFCCC Article 6 process, which is essentially what we're using to guide the carbon removal sector cooperation on an international level. But again, this process is taking time, it's going slower than we hope. And so for now, I think we need to focus on national and national and regional cooperation.
Can we, without going down the Article 6 rabbit hole, I would like to, I think personally for me, I've had to kind of consistently learn and relearn what's happening there because of, the work we do in different countries. But where do you see the status of that now, and how do we resolve some of the problems around it? I know that's a big question. It could almost be its own podcast, but yeah. And do you see it as an opportunity that is going in the right direction, or I don't want to just call it a challenge, but I do see about, I read a lot about it, and there are challenges around it for sure.
I mean, it's maybe just for context, Article 6.2 essentially manages treaties between governments on things like carbon credits. Article 6.4 does so between companies. And 6.2, for example, is already operational. We already have seen a bunch of agreements between Japan, I think, is leading. They've done more than a dozen. Switzerland has done a lot. And countries are getting ready for this. The challenge is that the carbon removals piece on defining how carbon removals can fit into it hasn't been adopted yet, hasn't been finalized. So at the last COP in Dubai, there was hope that they would make significant progress on this. They didn't. Now the hope is Azerbaijan this year, and there's currently a call for input by the UNFCCC, maybe that can be linked as well, where people and companies can submit their thoughts on methodologies for carbon removal. And we hope that this year's COP will be a breakthrough. But again, we hoped the same last year. And so I'm personally not as optimistic that this will be up and running in the time that we need it to, but it will eventually, and it will become an important element where governments will be able to trade carbon removals essentially with each other, which is what we need, because the global south, the tropics, are a much better environment to do a lot of work on carbon removals. Not all, but for things like biochar, for things like enhanced weathering, we can be much more effective in the global south than in the global north.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's definitely what we're seeing. And I suppose on a positive note there, the calls, when I'm speaking to the Malawi government, the Kenya government, you're seeing a lot more awareness and a push to get all the, the right kind of legislation through. So, but what are some of the biggest challenges you face, when advocating for climate policies? Is it, yeah, what are some of the things you're seeing as big challenges beyond what you've already mentioned, I suppose?
I think really kind of three challenges that immediately come to mind. One is just a lack of education on the topic. I mean, we started off it right, and even people who work on climate, even people who work on carbon markets get things confused all the time, like carbon capture and carbon removals, right?
Yeah.
And so talk about the broader public. They have no clue. If you tell them carbon removals, they might think it's some kind of geoengineering or it's some sort of fan that stands in Iceland at best. Like they don't really know what it is. And that is the biggest challenge by far. We need to do a lot of educational work. We need to tell better stories. We need to get better communications people into the sector. The second thing is opposition by environmental organizations. And for me, on a personal level, this is really tough. I grew up in a hippie environmental activist family. I always considered myself an environmentalist. And now I'm doing policy work, and I'm constantly faced with opposition by the very people that I used to vote until 2 years ago. And I'm trying to understand why. And basically, you have a lot of the environmental NGOs, the environmental left, that have gone down. They have been leading calls for emission reductions, thankfully. But they haven't moved on to what the IPCC since 2019 is saying of emission reduction and carbon removals. They're stuck on emission reduction only, and anything that's not solar and wind is bad. And that is a problem because they are fighting actively against a lot of the policies we need and delaying climate action. And I think they're shooting themselves in the foot because they will lose a lot of voters like myself because of that. But that's kind of for me, almost unexpected, huge challenge that I encountered in my work. And the final one is, but that's more of a one that can be solved. How do we progress climate policy without talking about climate? I do a lot of work in the US, and I need to work with climate skeptic Republicans. I need to get them to pass policy that will scale carbon removal. And I spend a week in DC and I don't mention climate change. And again, that's a solvable challenge. Yeah. You need to focus on the co-benefits, for example, or jobs, or all the other good things that we can create, sustainable industries, right? But this is, I think, more of a communication tactical challenge: is how do we progress this policy without calling it such?
Yeah, I can relate to that fully. It makes a lot of sense. Focusing on, I mean, that must be particularly challenging when you're over there in the States trying to push that agenda. But I can relate to it. And it does make sense. You've got to focus on the other aspects of it that are positive as well. Cleaning up the planet in general. So, do you have any good stories, good success stories? Projects you've been involved in that highlight, the kind of where policy change is meaningful, where it really, aids climate action.
Anyone working on policy will know that policy successes tend to take between 4, 5, 6 years before you see a tangible result. So given that I've been doing this for 2 years, I can tell of intermediate achievements, but it gives people a good idea. But you need a lot of patience to do this work. So one example is we've got the carbon removal certification framework in the EU, which actually, we're recording this on 10th of April, will be passed expectedly today in the European Parliament. It's a big day today. And this for me is almost the most important piece of carbon removal legislation in the world. It will quickly become the gold standard for what high quality removal is and how we can certify it in the EU, probably abroad. And I've been working on this file for 2 years since it was released as a draft. And in many moments, this file was looking to restrict what technologies could be part of it quite significantly, which I thought was a bad idea on so many different levels. Along with many others, and I want to call out, for example, Carbon Gap, which is the leading CDI NGO in Europe. Along with Carbon Gap and others, we've been leading efforts to keep the CSCF technology open. We published a letter signed by 350 companies. We have been tirelessly speaking to policymakers. And the legal text that is going to be passed today is technology neutral. And it wasn't at all times. And these are wins that are huge, that will make a massive difference, not just for industry and for all the different technology sub-industries, but really for the climate, because we get more shots on target. And again, there's a lot more that needs to be said in terms of how this is going to be implemented, but just in terms of the legal text, this is a very clear example of where advocacy has led to a positive result.
That's interesting. On that note, where do you, when you look to the future, where do you see technology heading? Even in the last couple of years, really, there's been so much innovation and there's more to come. Are there things that you're particularly excited about in the sector when it comes to technology, innovation, new products and services with kind of hitting targets?
as you said, I mean, almost one of the most exciting things in the sector is the pace of innovation. I speak to suppliers, technology providers that have come up with something new almost every week. And it's just incredible. Again, why we need technology openness and policy, right? Is because we don't know what will get us to 10 gigatons. I'm almost certain we don't know the technologies yet, right? We're still in the early stages, in the V1s, V2s of the sector. In terms of where I think we're heading, it's commodification, right? Like, I think this has to become a commodity market. What does that mean? It with a compliance government scheme. So for me, this means we're going to have a quality bar set by the government, additionality, permanence, co-benefits, all of that. And then the cheapest one wins. That's how we get to gigatons. Now, that's not what we need today. If you did that today, then you would essentially kill innovation and development of this industry at its very beginning. So we need a diversified portfolio of policies that also supports more expensive technologies today to get them down the cost curve. And then in 7, 8, 10 years, we should totally have a commodity market where we're just like, okay, you're the cheapest, $70 per ton of permanent removal. Yeah. We're going to do just that. And we're going to scale it to oblivion. That's where I think this should go and where I hope it will go.
I mean, in terms of accelerating that, makes a lot of sense. I think there's a way to go. But, in terms of what advice do you give to policymakers bringing in legislation? I mean, maybe you kind of hinted at it then anyway, but yeah, what's the kind of advice you give to policymakers with new legislation that comes in to kind of accelerate this space?
I like to kind of think, so first key principle here is a portfolio approach, diversification of risk, both to maximize our chances of achieving climate targets and, frankly, as an industrial policy. Right? Like, we need to diversify risk. What the US has done, for example, they've gone really heavy on direct air capture.
Yeah.
From an industrial and climate perspective, if direct air capture doesn't turn out to be the main answer, I'm not saying it won't. I think it has a lot of potential. But if it doesn't, then they're kind of stuck, right? So I think you have to have a portfolio approach. So when you think about policies, and actually I published an article on this yesterday that we can also reference in the show notes, that one essentially goes through all the options that governments have, from compliance to procurement to subsidies and financial incentives. And I would recommend that a government looks at their experience, for example, in renewables. If they have experience with feed-in tariffs, do the same for CDR. If they have experience with contracts for difference, do it in CDR, public procurement, and so on. Compliance markets. And so build on your existing experience, because this stuff is complicated. Like, the regulatory hurdles for some of these are really high. So having policymakers that can relate to the mechanisms and just adapt them to carbon removals while focusing on this portfolio approach, that I think is what should be done, and that leads to a different answer in different countries.
So you mean, so when you're talking portfolio, which obviously we see from a buyer point of view right now, people buying on the voluntary market, buying it with a portfolio type mindset, but you're talking about legislating that from a what people should be buying, or legislating that from a what is available in terms of the different types of technologies out there?
Right now, the focus has to be on scaling technologies, validating them, and driving them down the cost curve. And technologies are at different levels of maturity. And so if you have a very mature technology, you could, for example, focus on public procurement, right? You can be like, okay, you're already up and running, your business works, we're just going to buy the credits from you to help you scale. For other technologies that are very early on, say, I don't know, ocean alkalinity enhancement, they might need more research funding, right, to validate the safety of it and get rid of concerns that exist around ecosystem impact. And then you've got others more in the middle, say direct air capture, but they really need CapEx support to get set up these really expensive facilities in the first place, right? So they might benefit from a CapEx tax credit. So and overall, the picture that has to emerge is that the government can look at the portfolio of CDR policies and see we have many shots on target.
Makes sense. We're talking about business, we're talking about government. Sometimes I think as an individual, it can be overwhelming, right? When you look at, what needs to be done. And I just wondered actually, from your point of view, if you ever get this question, what advice do you give to individuals who want to kind of feel they're making some sort of impact in the journey we're on? Because it can get you down if you're on the wrong social media channels, if you're, just feeling that, can I really make a difference as an individual? What advice do you give to people having that kind of thought and wondering what they should do?
I've written about this and done some thinking last year, and where I've landed is essentially we've got three things, right? We've got time, we've got money, and we've got attention. And those are the things we should devote to climate change. And in order of priority, it's that. First, time. If we can switch careers, there's great jobs in climate change now. Yeah. Like, for me, it's the most important challenge we are facing as humanity. There are few excuses not to work on climate change. And so the time's never been better to actually work on climate change. If you can't work full-time, work part-time, volunteer. But your time is the most important asset you have. The second thing is, and by the way, on that first thing, that keeps your sanity. I've been doing so much better just with, managing my mental health when it comes to the climate crisis since I've been surrounded by people working on solutions. And the second thing for me is money. Start offsetting your own life, right? Like start buying quality carbon removals. And I'm not saying you need to do everything, but get into the habit. Start buying a bit here and there. Again, we can link it in the show notes. I've written about all the options where people can buy nowadays, and start putting your money where your mouth is and essentially purchasing offsets. And then the final thing is attention. Follow the right people, follow the right media. And start, devoting, which has become a really precious asset, right? Instead of scrolling endlessly on Instagram, follow some people who actually write some interesting stuff or say some interesting stuff on the matter. But yeah, those are the things that I would recommend to people.
Cool. And a good segue to a closing question. What's your vision for the future, for the sector, for policy, for advocacy, for the climate situation in general, I suppose?
Big question to anyone. Okay, let me see. So I believe that the digital space has changed everything. And I think in a very positive way when it comes to advocacy. Advocacy has been democratized. It has become more effective, more accessible. And so I believe that we can now get thousands, tens of thousands, in future millions of people to support specific advocacy campaigns, and almost pressure policymakers to do the things we need them to do in a much more direct and accessible way. And so this is something that I find very exciting. And how specifically to do it? Again, follow people in the sectors that you are interested in. In carbon removals, for example, I share a lot. Follow me on LinkedIn, subscribe to my newsletter, but also, for example, Evie Tummy. Follow her on LinkedIn. She has a lot of call to actions. She, for example, has a lot of knowledge on the UN mechanism. And there are many opportunities, both at the EU consultations. They're always open for individuals. Any person from anywhere in the world can submit their opinion, and numbers count. They have to review every single answer. They do keyword searches and look at what appears most often, right? And that gets prioritized. So I think people need to embrace the digital world and space, and LinkedIn works really well for carbon removals, to become active, because it's fairly easy nowadays, to be honest. And so, get going.
Cool. You've mentioned a few links and names. I will definitely leave all of these in the show notes for anyone who's tuned into the podcast. I didn't have any more questions, but is there anything I didn't ask that you'd like to share that you feel is important?
Honestly, for me, the most motivating aspect of my job is seeing how many people just like me are moving into the space. And every day, and I keep getting more calls and messages from friends of mine who are like, "Hey, actually, I saw you working in carbon removals. I'm considering a move," and that's incredible. And so this is something that I just really encourage people, especially people who are not yet in carbon removals but are considering a move. Get in touch with me or with anyone else already working in the space. Have a chat. There's a very few exceptions of people who've been working on this stuff for 10, 15 years, but almost everyone else is coming from another place. So don't be scared by that. All skill sets are welcome, and just get in touch, have a conversation, and hopefully you can join soon too.
Awesome. Well, on that note, firstly, thank you very much for taking the time to join. It's, like I say, I'm interacting with you online a fair bit, but we haven't yet got to speak. So I appreciate the time. And for anyone else who wants to get in contact or wants to learn more, I will leave this in the notes, but do you want to just share the best place to learn more about Sebastian, the work you do, and get in touch?
Yeah, I mean, being true to what I said, LinkedIn is the main channel. So follow me there, get in touch with me there. But then I do also have a website. I have a newsletter called the Giga 10, where once a month I kind of share the top 10 highlights that I've seen in the market and in the policy space. So those are all avenues. And then I love doing calls with people I don't know. I schedule a couple every week. So get in touch with me. Let's have a quick chat and take it from there.
Cool. Sounds good. Sebastian, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.